She was screaming into the empty heat long before anyone heard her, a desperate sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Lincoln Prairie. The sun was a white-hot fist pounding down on the dry earth, and Maggie Doyle's voice cracked under its oppressive glare as if the desert itself was actively trying to silence her. Every ragged, involuntary gasp was a dry sob that did little to relieve the burning ache in her throat. She hung, cruelly twisted, on a crude, upright wooden frame, nothing more than two scarred planks lashed together, erected hastily and maliciously in the middle of nowhere. One leg was yanked high by a thick rope that dug mercilessly into her inner thigh, while her wrists were bound tightly together above her head, straining every tendon in her shoulders. The coarse wood scraped against her skin, and fine dust, kicked up by the relentless wind, powdered the raw, bleeding patches on her arms and neck. Her worn calico dress, already torn by the rough handling she'd endured, had slipped tragically, exposing her further to the elements and, more devastatingly, to the world. She kept trying to pull the fabric down with her bound hands, a futile gesture of modesty, but the position of the rope and the constant movement of the burning wind only made her shame worse, a visceral, compounding torment that eclipsed the physical agony. The worst part, the absolute core of her suffering, wasn't the searing pain of the cuts or the dizzying heat stroke threatening to claim her mind. It was the terrifying, sinking realization that if anyone did find her, they would see nothing but a broken, humiliated body left for the scavenging vultures, and never the truth she held inside. She whispered for help, a plea so quiet it was barely audible even to her own ears, knowing with chilling certainty that the desert had no mercy, and that the only echo she'd receive was the sound of her own rattling breath. This was Prescott's message, a brutal declaration of ownership and control, and his men had tied her up and ridden away laughing, confident that the heat and the public exposure would make her confess to whatever lie he demanded before the sanctuary of nightfall. But there wasn't anything to confess, only a dangerous, essential truth she feared would die with her if no one, absolutely no one, heard it before her strength finally gave out. The hours crawled by like injured things, stretching the minutes into an eternity of blinding light and scorching air. Maggie's head drooped, pulled down by exhaustion and the relentless, blood-pounding migraine the sun had gifted her. She focused intently on a small, pale stone half buried in the cracked earth below her boots, trying to lose herself in its smooth, unremarkable texture, anything to avoid confronting the reality of her suspension. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, tasting of salt and dust, and her mind was beginning to slide into a hazy place where the shadows seemed to whisper the names of the men who had done this. The ropes were now cutting deep grooves, not just into her flesh, but into her very spirit, tying her to a destiny of public degradation. The pain in her knee, where the rough hemp had been cinched tight, was a blinding, constant throb that radiated up her leg and into her hip. She wanted to scream again, to rage against the injustice that had chosen her, a simple bookkeeper who dared to question a cattle count, but she was out of sound. A primal, instinctual awareness, the kind born only from sheer survival, suddenly yanked her from the brink of unconsciousness. A shadow finally moved on the horizon, not the black, predatory shadow of a circling bird, but a low, dark shape that grew steadily larger and firmer against the shimmering heat haze. A rider was approaching, slow and cautious, the dust rising in a pale, telltale plume behind the hooves, a fragile promise of intervention or a terrifying sign of return. A fresh wave of fear, cold and sharp, cut through the oppressive heat. She prayed with every fiber of her failing strength that it wasn't one of Prescott's men returning to finish what they had started, to turn her suffering into a spectacle of death. The rider stopped about 50 feet away, hesitating near the border of the sagebrush, assessing the bizarre and horrifying tableau. He swung a leg over the saddle horn, dismounted with the tired, practiced economy of a man accustomed to long days, and dropped the reins. He stood there for a long moment, a tall figure silhouetted against the unforgiving light, his shoulders slightly stooped, radiating a quiet caution that felt almost weary. Then he began to walk slowly toward her, boots crunching on the dry soil, the sound loud and intrusive in the dead silence. When he finally stopped right beside her, Maggie managed to lift her head just enough to meet his gaze. She found a pair of deeply set, tired blue eyes under the dusty brim of a worn, low-slung cowboy hat. They were not the cruel, calculating eyes of Prescott or the lazy, grinning eyes of his henchmen. They were eyes that seemed to have already seen too much of the hard world. Jacob Hale didn't speak a single word at first. He only stared in silent, unmistakable shock at the sight of her. A woman suspended in the boiling wind, a living sacrifice to someone else's greed and malice. His initial expression was one of simple disbelief, an immediate recognition of profound wrongness. Then, inevitably and without warning, his gaze slipped lower, compelled by the very nature of her agonizing posture. His eyes fell, inadvertently but inescapably, into the private place she wanted hidden more than anything else on earth. The torn hem, the exposed skin, the humiliating vulnerability the ropes had forced upon her. A blaze of pure, agonizing shame shot through her like fire, a searing, white-hot pain that dwarfed the physical agony in her joints. Her voice, miraculously, ripped out of her throat, a harsh, desperate cry of pride and violation. "Don't look there." The raw power and desperation in those three whispered words instantly severed the trance of shock that had held Jacob captive. He jerked his head away, his face instantly burning with a deep, reflexive guilt, an awareness of his transgression that felt immediate and physical. He couldn't unsee what he had seen, the torn dress, the exposed, bruised skin, the desperate curve of her body as she struggled for dignity. He couldn't pretend the marks on her skin were anything less than the deliberate, malicious work of a monster. He looked up at the sun, at the empty prairie, and back at the woman hanging before him, and the question that slammed into his conscience was simple, sharp, and terrifying. Would he, like so many others had undoubtedly done, ride away and leave her to die, saving himself the trouble and the danger? Or would he choose the unthinkable, the heroic, and risk everything he had left in this weary life to save a woman he was never meant to see, a woman whose pain was now indelibly printed on his memory? Jacob didn't leave. He stood his ground, rooted to the spot, not after hearing her voice shake like that, not after witnessing the violent purple bruises already blossoming on her exposed legs, and certainly not after seeing the subtle but unmistakable burned mark, a signature of cruelty that no human being should ever be made to carry on their skin. He stood there in the boiling wind, trying to steady his breath, trying to control the sudden furious surge of protective instinct that rose up in his chest, forcing him to decide, in that very instant, what kind of man he was going to be today. The decision was not a calculation of risk, but a quiet, internal confirmation of a promise he had made long ago to his own wounded conscience. Instead of retreating, Jacob stepped closer. His movements were slow, careful, and deliberate, designed not to alarm the already terrified woman. Maggie, reacting entirely on pure, exposed instinct, tried to twist her body away from him, to shield herself, but the ropes held her tight, a mocking cage of hemp and wood. She squeezed her legs together, a final futile gesture, whispering the command again, even softer this time, a plea rather than a shout. "Don't look there." Jacob swallowed hard, the dry heat making the action difficult, but the tension in his jaw was clear. He lifted both hands slightly, palms open, a universal, ancient signal of non-aggression and peace. "Ma'am, I ain't here to stare," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, rough with dry dust and an honest, sudden guilt. "I'm here because you look like you're dying." His voice was not the theatrical pronouncement of a hero, but the sober declaration of a practical man facing a tragedy, and Maggie heard it. The sincerity cut through the shame and the panic. Most men in this territory were liars when they played the hero, their actions always preceded by calculation or ego. But Jacob didn't move like a liar. He moved like a man who had seen too much of human misery, perhaps in the war, perhaps in the hard-scrabble life of the frontier, and simply didn't want to add another avoidable ghost to the heavy burden of his conscience. He began to circle the crude wooden frame, his eyes focused entirely on the knots, checking the rope placement with a grim, professional intensity. His fingers brushed against the thick, tightly bound hemp at her wrist, and he let out a soft, unhappy curse under his breath. The knots were tied to cut into the skin under strain, deliberately designed to cause maximum pain and inhibit circulation. Prescott style. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her, his voice hardening with realization. Maggie flinched violently when she heard that name, the sound of it like a cold lash across her already raw spirit. Jacob leaned in, his tired blue eyes meeting her frightened ones, and spoke low, his voice a conspiratorial whisper against the vast silence of the prairie. "If he did this to you, he meant to break more than just your bones, didn't he?" Maggie's eyes closed instantly, and a single, hot tear, a testament to her hidden suffering, slid over the ridge of her dust-caked cheek. Jacob ignored the tear and focused on the immediate life-saving task. He reached out and touched her ankle gently, checking the circulation below the restrictive knot. She jerked away again, a spasm of pain and fear shooting through her leg. "Easy, easy now," he soothed. "I'm just making sure you can feel your foot, making sure the blood is still moving." Her voice was a cracked, dry whisper, barely audible. "I can feel all of it, and I wish I couldn't." He looked up at her face again, their eyes locking for the first time without the intervening barrier of fear, shame, or initial shock. That single, shared look, a deep, momentary communion between two exhausted souls, told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't guilty. She wasn't wicked. She was quite simply a woman trying to survive a brutal world that seemed to take a perverse, deliberate pleasure in breaking the softest, most principled people first. Jacob took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of hot dust and sagebrush filling his lungs, and he made his choice final. "All right, I'm getting you down, now." The decision was made, the commitment sealed, and Jacob drew the knife. Not a showy Bowie knife, but a practical, worn, bone-handled folder from his belt sheath. But before the steel could touch the rough hemp, a new sound, sharp and intrusive, cut across the quiet of the empty field. Hoofbeats. Not the slow, steady rhythm of a solitary rider, but the fast, pounding gallop of two horses returning, their pace too urgent to be coincidence. Prescott's men. The reality of the danger slammed into Maggie's chest like a physical blow, a rush of cold dread that momentarily eclipsed the burning heat. The simple, terrifying question now consumed her mind. Would Jacob fight to save her now that lethal danger was right in front of him, immediate and unavoidable? Or would he abandon her to save himself, retreating into the anonymity of the wilderness, leaving her worse off than before? Jacob, too, heard those hoofbeats, and every old, dormant instinct honed during his time in the war, the sharp awareness, the immediate cold calculation of risk, snapped awake. He didn't have the luxury to think, to weigh outcomes, or to regret his choice. Thinking got people killed. Action was all that mattered. He stepped in close to Maggie, moving with sudden, surprising speed, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his chest against her side. "Hold on," he said softly, a promise and a command, before she could even ask to what. The knife flashed, a blur of silver in the brilliant sunlight. The rope at her wrist snapped free with a sudden, dull pop. Pain rushed back into her arms as blood, restricted for hours, began to surge back into her extremities. She bit down on a cry, tasting blood, driven more by stubborn, desperate pride than any real strength. Jacob immediately moved to the rope on her raised leg. One quick, decisive cut, and the tension was gone. As the frame was no longer holding her, Maggie sagged instantly, her weight collapsing forward. Jacob caught her around the waist, his arms strong and firm, supporting her utterly drained body. For a horrifying split second, her torn dress slipped again as she dropped, and she hissed out her desperate plea for the last time. "Don't look there!" He didn't. His gaze remained firmly fixed on the horizon and the approaching riders. Instead, with quick, rough but fiercely protective hands, he pulled his own coat loose, a heavy, stained canvas duster, and wrapped it around her hips and legs, tying the sleeves around her waist to secure the covering. "Better?" he asked, the question clipped and sharp. She managed a weak nod just as the two horses slid to a brutal, earth-shattering stop in a spray of dust 20 feet away. Prescott's men. The first one, a skinny, sharp-featured fellow with noticeably bad teeth, grinned wide when he saw Maggie on the ground, supported by a strange man. "Boss said leave her till sundown," the skinny man drawled, his hand already moving toward the butt of his pistol. What are you doing, Hale?" The man recognized him. Jacob straightened up, placing himself entirely between Maggie and the two men, using his body as a shield as best he could, but his voice was steady, flat, and entirely unruffled by the immediate threat. "I am changing the schedule." The two men were locked in a desperate, grunting, bloody struggle, Jacob breathing raggedly through his mouth, fighting the waves of blinding pain, the drunkard trying to pin him down. Maggie, slumped on the ground, watched the blood pouring from Jacob's face, the terror momentarily displaced by a cold, burning rush of desperate necessity. Driven by pure panic and something that felt a great deal like stubborn, inherited pride, she scrabbled in the dust with her still numb hands until her fingers closed around the cold steel of the fallen pistol. She snatched it up with both hands, the weight unfamiliar and heavy. She had never, not once in her 20-odd years, fired a pistol in her life. She didn't pause to think, didn't check the safety, didn't aim. She simply pointed the black muzzle vaguely toward the sky and squeezed the trigger with all the desperate strength she could summon. The resulting shot cracked through the empty field like a clap of deafening thunder, the sound echoing endlessly across the quiet prairie. Both men, locked in their brutal dance, instantly froze. They flinched violently, hands flying away from their belts and each other, their attention entirely focused on the sudden, earth-shaking noise and the woman holding the smoking gun. "You want to try that again?" she shouted, her voice shaking violently but loud and clear enough to be understood. "Next time, I might not miss." They looked from Jacob's bloodied, determined face to the woman with wild, feverish eyes and a smoking pistol, and whatever meager courage the whiskey and the belief in Prescott's power had given them instantly leaked right out of their boots. The threat was real, the situation suddenly inverted. They backed toward their horses, cursing under their breath, holding their bruised jaws, then swung up awkwardly and rode off at a terrified gallop, disappearing into a cloud of shame and dust, defeated by a bleeding, half-dead woman and a worn-out ex-soldier. Jacob stood for a long moment, swaying slightly, trying to pull air back into his bruised lungs. He wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his sleeve and spat a dark streak of tobacco juice and blood into the dust, a gesture of finality. He looked down at Maggie, still clutching the heavy revolver. "Can you sit a horse?" he asked, his voice rough and strained. "I will fall off," she whispered, the panic receding now, replaced by debilitating exhaustion. "I will catch you," he stated, his gaze meeting hers with absolute certainty. He took the pistol from her trembling hands and shoved it into his belt. Then, with a grunt that sounded like it came from the deepest part of his gut, he lifted her into the saddle of his waiting horse. He swung up immediately behind her, one strong arm firm and protective around her waist so she wouldn't slide, the other taking the reins. He didn't wait. The horse leaped forward past the creaking, groaning wooden frame, a monument to her suffering, and headed toward the distant, hazy line of the Capitan Mountains. As the prairie wind hit her face, a rush of cool, blessed air, Maggie tried to breathe deeply, but the world kept tilting sideways, spinning violently despite the steady gait of the horse. Her fingers loosened in the horse's coarse mane, and her head fell back, resting against the solid, warm bulk of Jacob's shoulder. "Stay with me," he murmured urgently against her hair, but her eyes were already rolling shut, the exhaustion, the pain, the shame, and the relief all conspiring to pull her under. The last thing she felt was the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her back, a profound, anchoring rhythm of life and safety. And then the brutal world finally went dark. The horse labored steadily, carrying the double burden up the rising ground, the initial frenzy of escape giving way to the grinding exhaustion of a forced journey. By the time the Capitan Hills rose up from the prairie floor like a row of tired, ancient giants, solidifying from the haze into real stone and shadow, Maggie wasn't fighting the saddle anymore. The adrenaline that had fueled her brief moment of defiance had completely burned out, leaving her an empty shell. She was now out cold, her entire weight sagging heavily against Jacob's chest, a dead weight that simultaneously comforted and concerned him. She was hot to the touch, burning with a rapidly escalating fever, and her breath was shallow, ragged and distressingly fast. Each inhalation a desperate, audible struggle against the sickness settling deep in her lungs. Jacob had to shift his posture constantly, easing the pressure points on his own weary body while securing her with a firm, protective arm. His focus was singular: forward motion, finding cover, survival. An old, ugly scar along his ribs, a permanent souvenir from the brutal fighting in the field of Shiloh years ago, throbbed with every jolting breath the horse took. It was a familiar, unwelcome ache, a reminder of past pain. But he ignored it, the way he had learned to ignore most of his own discomfort and fear over the years. His priority was the fragile life leaning against him. He guided the horse off the main dusty wagon trail, trusting the animal's intuition, along a narrow, faint deer path that wound precariously between sharp, angular rocks and low-lying scrub oak, the vegetation growing thicker and more sheltering as they ascended. The terrain grew rougher, the light starting to take on the long golden hue of the late afternoon, signaling that they had only a few hours of daylight left to establish a defensible position. Jacob pushed the horse until it was visibly straining, knowing that every foot of elevation and every dense thicket of juniper was a measure of safety against Prescott's inevitable pursuit. Prescott wouldn't simply let the insult of his men's defeat stand, and he certainly wouldn't allow the truth Maggie held to escape into the open air. Finally, Jacob spotted what he was looking for, a sheltered, shallow draw carved by millennia of runoff, tucked just above the dry bed of the Rio Bonito, under a wide, protective shelf of sun-baked stone. It was isolated, concealed from the main trail, and, most importantly, it offered shade and access to water. He dismounted first, his legs stiff and protesting from the long ride and the earlier fight, then carefully lifted Maggie down. Her skin was flushed and dry, radiating a disturbing heat. He laid her gently on the relatively cool, sandy earth, checking her pulse with a worn thumb. It was racing, thin and frantic. He quickly secured the horse, giving it a much-needed drink from his canteen, and then turned his full attention back to the urgent matter of the fever. The sun, now sinking rapidly towards the western peaks, casting long purple shadows that offered a welcome respite from the brutal intensity of the day. That first night, the fever broke loose with terrifying intensity. Maggie shivered violently, her small body convulsing despite the protective weight of Jacob's canvas duster, only to moments later burn with an agonizing internal fire. She tossed and turned, mumbling incoherently disjointed half-words spilling from her cracked lips, words about brands and numbers, about stolen hides, and, most chillingly, about a man's boots on her throat. Her terror in her delirium was a palpable thing, and Jacob could only watch, helpless against the unseen enemy raging in her blood. He knew this kind of fever, the one that broke the will before it broke the body. Moving with quiet urgency, he found the nearest source of water, a small, trickling pool where the Rio Bonito still held some moisture. He soaked a large bandana in the cold, clear creek water and laid it across her face, then her neck, and the unmarked parts of her legs, working in slow, rhythmic circles. The icy touch made her gasp and jerk, but the application was essential. He continued this exhausting vigil, repeating the process over and over until his own fingers went numb from the cold water and the constant work. He gently propped her head up against a saddlebag and, using a small tin cup, poured water between her parched lips, a little at a time, patiently waiting for her to swallow. The delirium continued to cycle, a cruel rotation of terror and exhaustion. At one point, her hand, weak and claw-like, reached out and scrabbled blindly at his shirt, her eyes wide and unfocused. She whispered the broken command again, the refrain of her shame and violation. "Don't look there." Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of her suffering a physical ache in his chest. "I'm not," he said, his voice low and steady, a grounding anchor in her chaotic darkness. "I am just keeping you here, Maggie. Just keeping you safe." He maintained his focus on her face, on the rising and falling of her chest, on the vital signs of life, deliberately ignoring the raw, exposed skin, respecting the painful line she had drawn between them. The night was a long, cold blur of fear, water, and whispered reassurances. Jacob remained beside her, leaning back against the cool rock, his own eyes burning with exhaustion, the rhythmic sound of her shallow breathing the only clock he recognized. He knew that if she could just survive the long night, if the fever would simply break, she would have a chance. He was running on instinct, on old, ingrained soldier's habit, and on the quiet, fierce determination he had rediscovered when he cut her down from that wooden cross. By the second sunrise, a pale, hopeful orange washing over the rough stone canyon, her breathing had finally settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The desperate, wild shine in her eyes had receded, replaced by a tired but remarkably clear consciousness. She was still weak, feeling an overwhelming fatigue that made every muscle protest, but the immediate threat had passed. She hated how weak her legs felt, hated the sense of complete physical dependency, but she couldn't deny the quiet, steady strength emanating from the man sitting beside her. The way he moved, the way he had tended to her throughout the night, made it clear that carrying her, protecting her, was not a burden, but a chosen duty. Jacob rose immediately, stepping back a few paces, giving her space to collect her scattered dignity. He set a warm, clean blanket down and waited for her to pull his canvas duster tighter around herself, asserting that small measure of personal privacy. His eyes, though tired, were clear and direct. "I'm going to look at that leg now, Maggie," he said quietly, his voice giving the pronouncement the weight of a necessary medical task, not a casual request. Maggie flinched, the reflexive fear and shame instantly returning, her voice barely a breath. "Not there, Jacob." His eyes met hers, holding her gaze with unwavering sincerity. "Not for me, Maggie. For you. Infection will take a leg faster than any bullet. We need to clean it." He knelt carefully at her side, making sure his body language conveyed professionalism and respect. He kept his gaze firmly locked on her face while his hands worked, slowly and meticulously untying the sleeves of the coat and peeling back the torn fabric of her dress. Only when she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod did he allow his eyes to drop, and even then he looked only long enough to assess the damage. What he saw was worse than he had feared. The skin around the brand, the deliberate, cruel mark, was angry red and grossly swollen, already ringed with ugly, deep purple bruises where the rope had been cinched or where she had been handled. There was dried blood and embedded grit where the rope had rubbed her raw during her terrifying suspension. He let out a slow, heavy breath through his teeth, a sound of profound anger and pity. "That man should be in chains, Maggie," Jacob muttered, the phrase thick with disgust. "That man owns half the cattle in Lincoln, Jacob," she answered, her voice regaining a thread of its normal strength, though now edged with profound bitterness. "And the law has supper at his table." She watched his jaw tighten, the muscles standing out sharply under his weathered skin, the look of a man processing an unbearable injustice. "Is that why he did this to you? Because you saw too much?" Her laugh came out thin, fragile, and utterly devoid of humor. "I saw his men cutting other brands off hides, Jacob. I saw extra cattle driven onto his summer grazing land, far more than any honest neighbor had reported missing. I was the bookkeeper. I handled the tallies. I told him the numbers didn't add up. I told him the accounts were flawed, that the scale of the theft was enormous. He looked at me and said my eyes were the problem, that I needed a lesson in seeing things the way they ought to be." She swallowed hard, the memory still fresh and searing. "The next thing I knew, I was being dragged out to that frame, and he made sure that the only thing anyone would ever talk about was my shame and my supposed confession, not the vast cold theft he was committing against the territory." Jacob cleaned the wound as gently and thoroughly as he could manage, his movements precise despite the roughness of his hands. He used water from his precious canteen and a strip of clean cloth torn from the hem of his own shirt, a deliberate, sacrificial gesture. Every careful touch of the water and the cloth burned, sending spasms of pain up her leg, but the sheer, undeniable care behind his actions cooled something essential in her heart, soothing the deeper wound of being abandoned and judged. "You didn't have to come back for me," she whispered, the quiet acknowledgement a profound offering of thanks. "Maybe not," he conceded, not meeting her eyes, focused on bandaging the wound. "But I saw what he carved into you, Maggie. I saw what he was willing to do to shut you up and cover his tracks. If I rode away from that, if I left that kind of cruelty unanswered, I am no better than him, and every step I take would remind me of it." The statement hung in the air, weighty and absolute. It was not heroism, it was the simple, difficult truth of a man trying to live up to a long-ago, hard-won ethical standard. They sat there for a long time as the sky turned from the bright blue of noon to the deep, complex gold of the fading day. Two people who had been complete strangers just a day before were now inexplicably and irrevocably bound together, not by romance or fate, but by a dangerous secret written onto her skin. Maggie stared out at the fading light, watching the long shadows crawl up the opposite canyon wall, and finally asked the question that had been clawing at her since he cut her down. It was the crucial, terrifying question of survival and justice. Jacob, what are you going to do when Prescott comes looking for you because of me? Are we going to run, ride west into New Mexico and disappear forever? Or are you going to ride back into that town and drag his sins, his thefts, and his cruelty into the sunlight for everybody to see? Jacob didn't answer right away. He just watched the sky bleed from gold to orange, the slow, deliberate change mirroring the weighty decision he was making. He looked like a man consulting the fading light, allowing the stillness of the desert to guide his choice. "When I was young, Maggie," he finally said, his voice quiet, reflective, and marked by a lifetime of hard-earned experience. "I wore a blue coat. I followed orders. I did what I was told, even when the orders were senseless and the results were carnage. I watched good men, innocent men, get hurt because I looked the other way, because I chose obedience over what I knew was right." His gaze found hers, steady and clear. "I promised God and myself, standing over a shallow grave in Tennessee, that I would never under any circumstance do that again, never stand by and look away." He stood up, stretching his aching back, and reached for the canteen. "But we aren't riding into Lincoln tomorrow," he added, tempering his resolve with practicality. "Not with you barely able to stand, and me breathing like an old mule who's carried too many loads." Instead of immediate, reckless action, he chose calculated survival. He lifted her carefully back onto the horse, securing her with blankets and his coat, and led the animal further into the hidden folds of the Capitan Hills. Their destination was not a distant territory or a high mountain refuge, but a specific place in the next valley, a small weathered ranch spread. This ranch was run by Cal Turner, a former federal soldier from Jacob's past, a grizzled, quiet man who owed Jacob his life from a desperate field hospital back east, where the guns never seemed to stop roaring. Jacob knew Cal could be trusted with a secret, and he knew Cal understood the difference between law and justice. When they finally arrived at Cal's remote homestead under the light of a new moon, Cal Turner took one long, assessing look at the two of them. Jacob, weary and bloodied, and Maggie, feverish and slumped. Cal looked at the brand on her leg, and the dark, deep bruises everywhere else, and his face went instantly stone cold, setting into a mask of quiet, furious resolve. The stage was set, not for retreat, but for a quiet, meticulous war, planned by the tired veterans of a different, larger conflict. She was screaming into the empty, oppressive heat long before anyone human heard her, a desperate, raw sound that was immediately smothered and absorbed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Lincoln prairie. The sun, a white-hot, furious disk, high in the bleached sky, was less a source of light and more a weapon, pounding down on the dry, cracked earth with punishing intensity. Maggie Doyle's voice cracked and tore under its glare, the sound dry and abrasive, as if the desert itself was actively trying to consume and silence her plea. Every ragged, involuntary gasp was a choking sob, doing nothing to relieve the burning, acid ache in her throat and lungs. She hung there, a figure of utter, agonizing humiliation, cruelly twisted on a crude, upright wooden frame, nothing more than two scarred planks of salvaged timber lashed together with merciless precision, a deliberate monument to malice, erected hastily and conspicuously in the heart of nowhere. One leg was yanked impossibly high by a thick, rough hemp rope that bit deep into the delicate skin of her inner thigh, while her wrists were bound tightly together above her head, the strain wrenching every muscle and tendon in her shoulders to the breaking point. The hours that followed were a torturous, drawn-out eternity, minutes stretching into an endless cycle of blinding light and scorching, dehydrating air. Maggie's head drooped low, pulled down by the sheer weight of exhaustion and the relentless, blood-pounding migraine the sun had delivered. She fixed her gaze intently on a small, pale, fractured stone, half buried in the cracked, alkaline earth below her worn boots, trying desperately to lose herself in the minute details of its smooth, indifferent texture, anything at all, to avoid confronting the horrifying reality of her agonizing suspension. Her lips were now cracked and bleeding profusely, tasting only of salt, thick dust, and copper, and her mind began its slow, treacherous slide into a hazy, disoriented place where the shadows seemed to detach themselves from the heat and whisper the names of the men who had orchestrated this cruelty. The ropes had cut deep, ugly grooves, not just into the vulnerable flesh of her skin, but into the very fabric of her spirit, chaining her to a destiny of public ruin. The pain in her knee, where the rough hemp had been cinched with focused malice, was a blinding, constant throb that radiated agonizingly up her leg, into her hip, and settled deep in her core. She wanted to unleash another scream, to tear the air with rage against the profound injustice that had singled her out, a humble, honest bookkeeper who had only dared to question the inflated numbers on a cattle tally. But she was entirely out of voice. It was a primitive, raw, and entirely instinctual awareness, the kind born only from the sheer, desperate clinging to survival that suddenly yanked her from the brink of total unconsciousness. A shadow finally moved on the far-off horizon, not the black, spiraling, predatory shadow of a circling bird, but a low, dark, distinct shape that grew steadily larger and firmer against the shimmering heat haze. A rider was approaching, his pace slow, cautious, and deliberate, the dust rising in a pale, fragile plume behind the rhythmic thud of the hooves, a fragile promise of unexpected intervention or a terrifying sign of the predator's return. A fresh, icy wave of fear, sharp and clean, instantly cut through the debilitating heat. She prayed with every remaining measure of her failing strength that it wasn't one of Prescott's men returning to savor or finish what they had initiated, to turn her living agony into a simple, final spectacle of death. The rider halted his horse approximately 50 feet away, hesitating just near the sparse border of the sagebrush, taking a long, sober moment to assess the bizarre, horrifying, and strangely theatrical tableau. He swung a leg over the saddle horn, dismounted with the tired, professional economy of a man accustomed to endless taxing days on the trail, and dropped the reins to the ground, a signal of momentary commitment. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a tall, slightly gaunt figure silhouetted against the relentless light, his shoulders carrying a noticeable weight, radiating a quiet, profound caution that felt weary rather than aggressive. Then, he began to walk slowly toward her, his worn boots crunching loudly on the dry, brittle soil, the sound intrusive and oddly comforting in the dead silence that had enveloped her for hours. When he finally stopped right beside her, Maggie managed to lift her head just barely enough to meet his gaze. She found a pair of deeply set, tired blue eyes looking back, peering out from beneath the dusty brim of a worn, low-slung cowboy hat. These were not the cruel, calculating eyes of Prescott, nor the lazy, vicious grin of his henchman. They were eyes that seemed profoundly weary, having witnessed too much of the hard, cruel world. Jacob Hale didn't utter a single word at first. He simply stared in silent, unambiguous shock at the appalling sight of her, a woman publicly suspended, a living, breathing sacrifice to someone else's avarice and power games. His initial expression was one of simple, unadulterated disbelief, an immediate, visceral recognition of a profound wrongness. Then, with the terrifying, inevitable pull of gravity and human weakness, his gaze slipped lower, compelled by the very nature of her humiliating posture. His eyes fell, unintentionally but inescapably, into the private, violated place she wanted hidden more than anything on earth. The torn hem, the raw, bruised skin, the complete, agonizing vulnerability the ropes had enforced. A blaze of pure, agonizing shame shot through her like concentrated fire, a searing, white-hot pain that, for a precious instant, eclipsed the physical throbbing in her joints. Her voice, miraculously, tore itself out of her throat, a harsh, desperate cry of ravaged pride and ultimate violation. "Don't look there!" The sheer, raw desperation and power in those three whispered words instantly snapped the trance of shock that had held Jacob captive. He jerked his head violently away, his face instantly flushing with a deep, reflexive guilt, an awareness of his transgression that felt immediate and searing. He knew he couldn't unsee what he had just witnessed. The torn dress, the exposed, bruised skin, the desperate, unnatural curve of her body as she struggled for even a shred of dignity. He couldn't pretend the marks and the posture were anything less than the deliberate, malicious handiwork of a brutal man. He looked up at the sun, then at the empty, indifferent prairie, and back down at the woman hanging before him. And the question that slammed into his conscience was simple, sharp, and profoundly terrifying. Would he, as too many other men had undoubtedly chosen to do, simply ride away and leave her to a miserable death, saving himself the trouble, the immediate risk, and the future danger of incurring Prescott's wrath? Or would he make the difficult, heroic choice, risking everything he had left in this tired, hard life to save a woman he was never meant to see, a woman whose profound public pain was now burned indelibly onto his mind? Jacob didn't leave. He stood his ground, rooted to the spot, unable to retreat after hearing her voice shake with such exposed terror, unable to ignore the violent purple bruises already blossoming on her exposed legs, and certainly not after seeing the subtle yet terrifying burned mark, a signature of absolute unmitigated cruelty that no human being should ever be forced to carry on their skin. He remained there in the boiling wind, trying desperately to steady his breath, fighting to control the sudden, furious surge of protective and righteous instinct that welled up in his chest, forcing him to decide, in that very instant, what kind of man he was truly going to be that day. The choice was not a calculated weighing of risk against reward, but a quiet, internal confirmation of a core promise he had made long ago to his own damaged conscience, a solemn vow to never simply look away again. The horse, a sturdy but clearly weary animal, labored steadily, carrying the unexpected double burden up the rising, difficult ground. The initial frantic adrenaline of their escape quickly dissipated, giving way to the grinding, muscle-deep exhaustion of a forced, hasty journey under duress. By the time the Capitan Hills finally rose up from the vast prairie floor, solidifying from a hazy, shimmering backdrop into real, tangible stone, dense shadow, and sheer, demanding elevation, Maggie wasn't consciously fighting the saddle anymore. The sharp shock of adrenaline that had briefly fueled her moment of fierce defiance had completely burned itself out, leaving her body a heavy, empty shell. She was now deeply unconscious, her entire weight sagging heavily and trustingly against Jacob's chest and shoulder. She was a dead weight, but one that strangely comforted him with its fragile presence, yet simultaneously alarmed him with its signs of distress. She was radiating heat, flushed and dry with a rapidly escalating fever, and her breathing was worryingly shallow, ragged and fast, each inhalation an audible, desperate struggle against the spreading sickness. Jacob had to continually shift and adjust his posture, easing the pressure points on his own tired body while securing her with a firm, protective arm cinched around her waist. His focus was singular and absolute: maintain forward motion, find immediate cover, and ensure their joint survival. An old, ugly, jagged scar along his ribs, a permanent, throbbing souvenir from the brutal, senseless fighting in the field of Shiloh years before, protested with a dull, insistent ache with every jostling breath the horse took. It was a familiar, unwelcome physical reminder of past failures and enduring pain, but he ignored it completely, the way he had learned, through necessity, to ignore most of his own discomfort, fear, and personal history over the years. His single immediate priority was the fragile, feverish life leaning against him. He guided the horse immediately off the main, dusty wagon trail, trusting the animal's weary intuition along a narrow, almost invisible deer path that wound precariously between sharp, jutting rocks and thickets of low-lying scrub oak. The vegetation grew progressively denser and more sheltering as they ascended, and the air, though still hot, was gradually becoming thinner and cleaner. The terrain grew steadily rougher, the light beginning to take on the long, horizontal, deep golden hue of the late afternoon, signaling they had only a precious few hours of daylight left to establish a defensible, hidden position. Jacob pushed the horse until he could feel it visibly straining, aware that every foot of elevation gained and every dense, obscuring thicket of juniper was a crucial, necessary measure of safety against Prescott's inevitable and certainly violent pursuit. Prescott, a man defined by his overweening pride and unchecked power, would never simply let the insult of his men's defeat and the threat of Maggie's knowledge stand unavenged. Finally, Jacob spotted precisely what his soldier's eye had been seeking: a sheltered, shallow draw, a natural cove carved by millennia of sudden runoff, tucked just above the mostly dry bed of the Rio Bonito, lying directly under a wide, protective shelf of sun-baked, fractured stone. It was perfectly isolated, thoroughly concealed from the main visible trail, and, most crucially, it offered deep shade and the promise of access to precious, life-saving water. He dismounted first, his legs stiff, protesting loudly from the extended, hard ride and the adrenaline-fueled fight hours before, then carefully and gently lifted Maggie down. Her skin was terribly flushed, dry and hot, radiating a disturbing internal fire. He quickly laid her on the relatively cool, protective, sandy earth, checking her pulse with a worn, steady thumb. It was worryingly fast, thin and frantic. He immediately secured the horse, giving the exhausted animal a much-needed drink from his limited canteen supply, and then turned his full, desperate attention back to the urgent matter of the fever, the sun now sinking rapidly towards the unforgiving western peaks, casting long, purple-black shadows that offered a welcome, temporary respite from the day's brutal intensity. That first, desperate night, the fever broke loose with a terrifying, full-blown intensity. Maggie shivered violently, her small, exhausted body convulsing despite the protective weight of Jacob's heavy canvas duster, only to moments later burn with a dry, internal, agonizing fire. She tossed and turned ceaselessly, mumbling incoherent, broken half-words that spilled uncontrollably from her cracked lips, words about brands and missing numbers, about the slaughter of the honest, and most chillingly and frequently about the heavy, crushing weight of a man's boots pressing hard on her throat. Her terror, even in her delirium, was a raw, palpable presence that seemed to fill the small drawer, and Jacob could only watch, feeling entirely helpless against the unseen, internal enemy raging in her blood and mind. He recognized this kind of consuming fever, the relentless one that threatened to break the patient's will long before it broke the body. Moving with quiet, desperate urgency, he located the nearest source of usable water, a small, barely perceptible trickling pool where the Rio Bonito still held some meager moisture beneath the sandy surface. He soaked a large, clean bandana in the cold, clear creek water and laid it gently across her face, then her neck and the relatively unmarked areas of her legs, working with slow, rhythmic, soothing circles. The icy touch made her gasp and jerk involuntarily, sometimes crying out, but the continuous soothing application was absolutely essential. He continued this exhausting vigil, repeating the process countless times over the course of the long night until his own fingers went completely numb from the cold water and the constant repetitive work. He gently propped her head up against a folded saddlebag and, using a small beaten tin cup, patiently poured water between her parched lips, a tiny amount at a time, waiting with saintly patience for her to manage a swallow. The agonizing cycle of delirium continued its cruel rotation, from terrified, shivering fits to moments of near-silent exhaustion. At one point, her hand, weak and claw-like in its desperate urgency, reached out and scrabbled blindly at his shirt, her eyes wide, unfocused, and shining with fever. She whispered the broken, desperate command again, the persistent, painful refrain of her shame and violation. "Don't look there, Jacob. Please." Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of her shared suffering a profound, emotional ache in his chest. "I'm not, Maggie," he said, his voice low, firm, and incredibly steady, a grounding anchor in the chaotic darkness of her mind. "I am just keeping you here, just keeping you safe. I am the wall, not the window." He maintained his visual focus on her face, on the slight, vital rising and falling of her chest, on the essential signs of life, deliberately, rigorously ignoring the raw, exposed skin, respecting the painful, inviolable line she had drawn between them. The night was a long, cold, painful blur of fear, water applications, and whispered constant reassurances. Jacob remained steadfastly beside her, leaning his tired body back against the cool rock face, his own eyes burning with the deep, accumulated exhaustion of days and the stress of the fight, the rhythmic sound of her shallow breathing the only clock he recognized. He knew that if she could just survive this single perilous night, if the fever would simply break and begin to recede, she would have a chance, a real, fighting chance. He was running entirely on old, ingrained soldier's habit, on the fierce, quiet determination that had been brutally reawakened when he cut her down from that desolate wooden cross. By the second sunrise, a pale, fragile but immensely hopeful orange washing over the rough stone canyon, her breathing had mercifully settled into a slow, rhythmic, steady cadence. The desperate, wild, feverish shine in her eyes had receded completely, replaced by a deep, tired but remarkably clear consciousness. She was still profoundly weak, feeling an overwhelming fatigue that made every muscle protest, but the immediate, lethal threat had definitively passed. She hated the debilitating weakness of her legs, hated the sense of complete, embarrassing physical dependency, but she couldn't deny the quiet, underlying strength and reliability emanating from the man sitting tirelessly beside her. The way he had moved, the way he had tended to her throughout the desperate night, made it profoundly clear that carrying her, protecting her, and nursing her was not considered a burden, but a freely chosen, necessary duty. Jacob immediately rose, stepping back a few protective paces, giving her the critical space needed to gather her scattered dignity and composure. "That man owns half the cattle in Lincoln County, Jacob," she answered, her voice regaining a remarkable thread of its normal, strong timbre, though it was now sharply edged with profound, weary bitterness. "And the law, every judge and deputy of it, has supper at his table. He is the law here." She watched his jaw tighten, the muscles standing out sharply under his weathered, dusty skin, the clear look of a man processing a vast, unbearable injustice. The enormity of Prescott's power was the central crushing problem. "Is that why he did this to you? Because you saw too much? Or because you talked too much?" Her sharp, sudden laugh came out thin, fragile, and utterly devoid of any humor, carrying only the weight of weary resignation. "I saw his men cutting other brands, legitimate, smaller brands, off countless hides, Jacob. I saw extra cattle driven onto his high summer grazing land every month, far more stock than any honest neighbor had reported missing or sold to him. I was the bookkeeper. My job was to handle the tallies, to keep his ledgers balanced. I told him the numbers simply did not add up. I told him the accounts were fraudulent, that the scale of the theft, the rustling was enormous and would eventually expose him. He looked at me with those cold, dead eyes of his and calmly said, my eyes were the problem, that I desperately needed a lesson in seeing things the way they ought to be, which to Prescott meant seeing only what he allowed me to see." She swallowed hard, the memory still fresh, searing and humiliating. The very next thing I knew, I was being dragged out by his thugs to that frame, and he made absolutely sure that the only thing anyone in Lincoln would ever dare to talk about was my sudden dramatic shame and my supposed imminent confession, not the vast, cold-blooded theft he was committing against every decent rancher in the territory. He hid his crime behind my humiliation. Jacob meticulously cleaned the severe, open wound as gently and thoroughly as his rough hands could manage, his movements precise and focused despite the inherent awkwardness of the task. He used water from his precious canteen and a strip of perfectly clean cloth he had torn from the hem of his own shirt, a deliberate, symbolic sacrifice of his own meager possessions. Every careful touch of the water and the cloth burned, sending spasms of intense, sharp pain up her leg. But the sheer, undeniable, unexpected care and focused respect behind his actions cooled something essential and deep within her heart, soothing the profound, agonizing spiritual wound of being utterly abandoned and harshly judged. "You didn't have to risk your life to come back for me," she whispered, the quiet acknowledgement a profound, heartfelt offering of thanks. "Maybe not," he conceded, not meeting her eyes, his attention entirely focused on the meticulous task of bandaging the wound with clean strips of fabric. "But I saw what he carved into you, Maggie. I saw what he was willing to do, the depths he would sink to, just to shut you up and efficiently cover his tracks. If I rode away from that kind of evil, if I left that kind of profound, calculated cruelty entirely unanswered, I am, by my silence, no better than him, and every single step I took westward would be haunted by the memory of it." The statement hung in the crisp, cool air of the canyon, weighty, absolute, and undeniably true. It was not the grand, theatrical pronouncement of a dime novel hero. It was the simple, difficult truth of a man trying desperately to live up to a personal, hard-won ethical standard forged in the hell of war. They sat there together for a long, quiet time as the brilliant sky turned from the bright, oppressive blue of noon to the deep, complex, reflective gold of the quickly fading day. Two people who had been complete strangers just a day before, bound only by circumstance, were now inexplicably and irrevocably bound by a dangerous shared secret written in bruises and a brand on her skin. Maggie stared out at the rapidly fading light, watching the long, deep shadows crawl up the opposite canyon wall, and finally asked the ultimate, crucial question that had been clawing at her since he had cut her down. It was the terrifying question that defined their entire future: survival versus justice. "Jacob, what are you going to do when Prescott comes looking for you because of me? Are we going to run, simply ride west into the vast New Mexico territory and disappear forever, hiding from the shadow of his power? Or are you going to ride back into that corrupt town of Lincoln and drag his sins, his thefts, and his immense cruelty into the sunlight for everybody to see? Jacob didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the sky bleed slowly from gold to a deep, resonant orange, the deliberate, slow change mirroring the weighty internal decision he was agonizingly making. He looked like a man consulting the fading light itself, allowing the stillness and moral clarity of the desert to guide his choice. "When I was young, Maggie," he finally said, his voice quiet, reflective, and noticeably marked by a lifetime of painful, hard-earned experience. "I wore a blue coat. I followed orders. I did exactly what I was told, even when those orders were clearly senseless, and the eventual results were pure, avoidable carnage. I watched good men, innocent farm boys, men who deserved better, get brutally hurt and senselessly killed because I looked the other way, because I chose the easier path of blind obedience over doing what I knew, deep down, was fundamentally right." His gaze found hers again, steady, clear, and uncompromising. "I promised God and myself, standing over a shallow, unmarked grave in Tennessee, that I would never, under any circumstance, do that again. I swore I would never stand by and simply look away from a clear, undeniable wrong." Cal's youngest nephew, a sharp, quiet boy who knew the back trails like the back of his hand, was immediately dispatched to a distant, neutral settlement to carry out the next, critical step. His mission was to hire a reliable professional photographer, the kind who knew how to carry his cumbersome camera equipment and fragile glass plates on a sturdy pack mule and conduct his business with absolute discretion. The nephew rode back 2 days later, successfully bringing the photographer, a nervous but skilled man named Mr. Finch, quiet and unseen to the relative safety of Cal's isolated ranch. Maggie, though still deeply apprehensive and physically weakened, set her jaw with a determined resolve that Jacob hadn't seen before. The time for shame was over. This was about justice. She allowed Mr. Finch to meticulously and professionally take high-quality photographs of the brand and the extensive bruises on her legs and body. These photographs were not merely pictures. They were proof on paper, evidence that could travel farther, faster, and more convincingly than her mere voice ever could. The glass plates and the resulting prints represented an undeniable, immutable physical record of Prescott's violence and his attempt to mask a colossal crime. Prescott had sought to make her shame public. They would ensure his own crimes became undeniable and permanently recorded. The men now had their full set of tools. A federal authority alerted, sworn testimony gathered, and definitive photographic proof of the crime against the witness. A few days later, fortified by Cal's strong coffee and the quiet solidarity of their purpose, Jacob and Maggie rode back toward Lincoln. This time, they were not alone. Cal and the other old soldiers followed not far behind, a solid, silent force of witnesses and protection. The stage was set for the final, confrontational ride into a town corrupted by one powerful,